God's chosen ones. They called you a lunatic, but your crazy talk just manifested before everyone. You nod when you want to shake people awake. And at night, when it's just you and your breath and the stillness pressing against your chest, you whisper the question that haunts every chosen soul. What if I'm wrong? Because the truth is, part of you wants to be wrong. You want the world to make sense. You want to believe that people aren't sleepwalking through their own destruction. You want to believe that anyone sees what you see, feels what you feel. And the truth is, you were never supposed to fit in. You were never created to blend into a broken world. You weren't sent here to disappear. You were sent to disrupt, to disturb, to awaken, to shift atmospheres and shatter illusions. You feel different because you are different. You were never meant to blend in. You were meant to lead. The world shifted, and so did their eyes on you. There is a moment when the noise of the world begins to fade, not because the world has gone quiet, but because something louder has awakened inside you. At first, you may not know what it is. It arrives without warning, a dream that lingers longer than it should, a number that appears too often to be coincidence, a feeling in your gut that something is shifting. You dismiss it, then feel it again. Louder, closer, clearer. And slowly you begin to wonder, am I being led? This is how awakening begins. Not with fire from the sky or booming voices from clouds, but with soft, persistent threads pulling at your soul. A dream that feels more real than waking life. A whisper in your spirit at the moment you're about to make a wrong decision. A nudge to turn left when logic says right. You don't have proof, but you have something stronger. You have knowing. You begin to move differently. You start to notice patterns, the way certain symbols keep appearing, the way certain names repeat, the way your spirit reacts to spaces before your mind understands why. You feel drawn to people you haven't met, places you've never seen, truths you've never studied, but somehow already understand. It is as if you are remembering something you were never taught. A wisdom older than your body, a voice not your own but deeply familiar. This is not imagination. This is awakening. And you are not the first to walk this road. Think of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, a teenage girl untrained in war, unversed in politics, yet she heard the voice of God and followed. She was mocked, feared, called delusional, but her courage shook nations. She led armies with a conviction that defied her age, her gender, her status. She claimed no glory for herself. She only followed what she heard in the quiet. When the world called her insane, she stood firm. Because when God calls you, you cannot unhear it. When the fire touches you, you cannot pretend you are cold. Or consider Daniel, the dream interpreter of Babylon, taken from his home, thrown into a foreign kingdom, surrounded by false gods. Still, he listened to the voice of the Most High. When others bowed to golden statues, he bowed only to truth. When others feared the king, he feared only the silence of God. His dreams were not dreams, they were blueprints, visions carved into the night to warn and prepare. He was not the strongest, but he was the clearest, because his ears were tuned to the divine. You begin to see these figures, not as distant legends, but as mirrors. Their stories begin to feel like echoes of your own. You realize you too have been chosen to hear, to sense, to know. Maybe you can't explain it. Maybe you still doubt it. But the signs haven't stopped. The dreams haven't faded. And the feeling that you are being led only grows stronger. You wake up at 3:33 a.m. for no reason. You feel chills during moments of silence. You look at someone and know what they're carrying before they speak. You feel a presence when you're alone, a tug, when you're lost, a push, when you're afraid. The world calls it intuition. The Bible calls it the Spirit. You know it is home. There is nothing random about this path. The veil is thinning. The timing is divine. You were not placed here to wander. You were placed here to awaken. You were not left behind. You were led ahead. The loneliness you feel is not isolation. It is elevation. You are walking where few dare, seeing what few are willing to see. feeling what most numb themselves to avoid. And still you go forward because something deep inside you already knows this path is not about being right, it's about being ready. Ready to listen, ready to obey, ready to carry what others dropped. You are not here to convince, you are here to become. So let them question, let them laugh, let them stay asleep. You are being called higher in every sign, every dream, every moment of divine interruption is an invitation to trust what you feel more than what you see. Your spirit is not confused, it is awake. You are not crazy, you are chosen, and the one who calls you by name is still speaking. Can you hear him? But awakening is not always glorious. You want to believe that this burden you carry is just a trick of the mind, not a calling too big for your weary shoulders. Because if you're wrong, then maybe you can let go. Maybe you can finally rest. Maybe you can be normal. But if you're right, if all the warnings, all the signs, all the visions you've held in your spirit are true, then the world is far blinder than you ever feared. And that thought, that's what breaks you, because the pain isn't in being called crazy. There is a shadow side to this journey that no one talks about. The crushing loneliness, the feeling of standing in a room full of people and still being unseen. The slow death of connection, not because you wanted it, but because it could no longer hold the weight of your truth. You start to notice the looks, the whispers, the way people pull back when your eyes hold too much. They don't know what to do with you. They call you intense, overwhelming, weird. Some even call you dangerous. You begin to feel like a stranger in your own life. Friends drift, family avoids the real conversations. You laugh a little less, not because you've lost joy, but because you can no longer pretend. You see too much, feel too deeply, sense what others dismiss, and while they keep moving forward in ignorance, you stand still aching, not because you don't know the way, but because the way is costing you everything. There comes a moment where you think maybe it would be easier to just stop. Maybe if I could just turn it off, go back to normal, blend and numb out, pretend. But the truth is you can't, because the awakening has already begun. The vision has already opened your eyes. And once you've seen, you can never unsee. Once you've known, you can never unknow. You try to silence the call, but it screams louder in the quiet. You weep, not because you're weak, but because you're tired. You are carrying something that cannot be named, a weight you never asked for, a fire that won't go out. You didn't choose this, it chose you. And now you walk through this world half visible, misunderstood, aching for connection, but unable to lie about who you are anymore. There is a cost to this path. It will strip you. It will break you. It will press you until you no longer know your old name. But buried beneath the grief, something holy is being formed. A resolve, a power, a calling. You are not breaking down. You are breaking open. You are being refined like gold in the fire. What feels like isolation is actually consecration. What feels like rejection is divine redirection. What feels like the end is only the threshold, because even when you want to quit, something won't let you. Even when your heart says, enough, your soul whispers, keep going. Even when your body is weary, your spirit refuses to lie down. You can't explain it. You can't walk away, because you're not just walking, you're being led. And the truth is, you were never supposed to fit in. You were never created to blend into a broken world. You weren't sent here to disappear. You were sent to disrupt, to disturb, to awaken, to shift atmospheres and shatter illusions. You feel different because you are different. You were never meant to blend in. You were meant to lead. Then one day the wind shifts. The same people who mocked you begin to grow quiet. The world once deaf to your voice starts to lean in. Headlines echo your words. Patterns you spoke of begin to emerge in public view. And for the first time, your silence becomes louder than their doubts. It was like that for Malachi, a 17-year-old boy from a small town no one could find on a map. He wasn't popular, wasn't loud, wasn't looking for attention, but he dreamed vivid, terrifying dreams of a sickness spreading through cities. He told his teachers. They laughed. He warned his community. They called him disturbed. He even posted online begging others to prepare. They deleted his words, flagged him as paranoid, but Malachi didn't stop. He kept speaking because something inside him refused to be silent. 3 months later, the outbreak came. First one case, then 10, then thousands. And just like his dream, the streets emptied. The fear spread faster than the sickness, and the very people who called him delusional began replaying his warnings. News reporters pulled his old videos. Doctors reviewed his notes. Suddenly, the lunatic had become the prophet. But Malachi didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply stood in what he always knew, that the message wasn't his, he was only the vessel. And when the world finally saw it, it wasn't validation he felt. It was responsibility, a holy ache to be ready for whatever came next. You see, there comes a moment when the truth you carry becomes too undeniable to ignore. A moment when the crowd that called you mad begins to tremble at your clarity. When they stop mocking and start listening, that moment is not to be wasted on revenge. It is a signal, a summons, a shift. This is when your purpose begins to burn brighter. This is when the light you carried in secret becomes a fire that cannot be hidden. And you, chosen one, begin to realize the pain was preparation, the mockery was confirmation, and the time is now. They see it, they feel it, they know. It's in watching the people you love stumble toward danger while you scream silently, knowing they won't listen. It's in holding the weight of truth with hands that tremble because no one taught you how to carry something so sacred alone. It's in the nights where you pray not for answers, but for sleep, because even dreams have become battlegrounds. You walk through your day wearing a mask you didn't choose. And you were never wrong. You were just early now rise, because the world is finally watching. You don't owe them peace for the war. They ignored. There comes a moment when the ache fades, not because it stops hurting, but because you finally stop hoping they'll ever understand. You stop looking over your shoulder for closure. You stop wondering if one day they'll realize what they did. And when that happens, something powerful shifts. The silence that once felt like a punishment becomes your protection. The distance they created becomes your path to freedom. You don't owe them anything. Not a conversation, not your presence, not your peace. They had their chance. They heard your voice, they saw your tears. They watched you carry the weight of truth with shaking hands, and they chose to mock, to dismiss, to turn away. They didn't lack evidence, they lacked courage, because your clarity demanded their transformation. And transformation terrifies people who are addicted to comfort. So they called you crazy, said you were too much, too intense, too emotional, too sensitive. But what they really meant was you were too awake. And nothing scares a sleeping world more than someone who sees in the dark. And now the world has caught up to what you tried to warn them about. The signs are no longer whispers. The visions are now reality, and the silence of your doubters screams louder than their laughter ever did. But you don't turn back to prove yourself. You don't wait for their validation. You don't need it anymore. You have become your own evidence. Your strength, your peace, your clarity, those are your receipts. You are no longer trying to explain your fire to those who fear the flame. You are no longer handing pearls to those who trample them in ignorance. You are no longer begging to be seen by people committed to misunderstanding you. You are done, not bitter, just done. Because somewhere along the way you realized that their opinion of you was never the point. Your mission wasn't to convince them. Your purpose was never tied to their belief. Your truth didn't come from their mouths, it came from something higher. So let them live with the weight of what they refuse to see. Let them sit in the echo of the words they once used to break you. Let them taste the silence they gave you and realize it was never weakness, it was power. Because even in silence, you stood tall. Even in rejection, you stayed faithful. Even in loneliness, you kept listening. And now everything you carried is manifesting. Not for their applause, but for your confirmation. You are not here to correct their ignorance. You are not here to comfort their regret. You are not here to clean up the mess they made by choosing fear over faith. That's not your responsibility. You owe them nothing, not forgiveness, not your energy. Forgiveness, if you choose to give it, is yours to offer, not theirs to demand. And if you decide to hold your peace instead of handing it to people who never honored it, that too is holy, because the truth is you gave them enough, more than enough. You gave them pieces of yourself hoping they would understand. You gave them time, space, second chances. You gave them grace when they gave you wounds. You showed them light and they cursed the brightness. That chapter is closed. You are not bitter. You are not angry. You are clear. You are walking forward with the kind of strength that doesn't need to yell, the kind of power that doesn't argue, the kind of peace that comes from knowing I don't need to win them back. I just need to keep moving. You are done explaining your purpose to those who tried to bury it. You are done shrinking to fit into places that were never meant to hold your fire. You are done giving access to people who never earned your presence. You are not arrogant, you are awake. You perform smiling, working, nodding, as if the knowing inside you isn't tearing through your bones like fire. You become an actor in someone else's play, delivering your lines. While the real script burns in your back pocket, no one sees the war behind your eyes. No one notices how tired you've become from fighting battles. No one acknowledges are even real, and still you keep showing up. You keep sensing, you keep feeling, because something in you refuses to die. And that is what they feared all along. That one day you would realize the truth. That one day you would stop asking, what did I do wrong? And start declaring, I was right to begin with. That one day you would no longer feel guilty for seeing what they couldn't. That one day you would no longer bend your truth just to make them comfortable. That one day you would stop waiting. That day is here. You are free now, free from needing their praise, free from chasing their love, free from the illusion that their approval ever meant anything. You were chosen not by them, by something greater, and that is enough. Walk forward, not out of spite, out of sovereignty, because you were never crazy, you were never broken, you were never too much. You were chosen and you owe them nothing. Not your words, not your forgiveness, not your energy, only your future, and it belongs to no one but you. You are the proof that truth waits and then rises. There is a moment quiet, sacred, when you no longer search for applause, when the need for validation evaporates like fog in morning sun, when your voice no longer trembles, not because the world has grown kinder, but because you have grown stronger. This is that moment you have walked through fire and the flames did not consume you. You've endured silence, betrayal, mockery, and doubt, but none of it could break you. Each scar became a signature of survival. Each trial carved a deeper well for wisdom. Each rejection forced your roots to reach further into something divine. You no longer stand in the shadows waiting for the world to catch up. You are not asking for a seat at their table. You are building your own altar where truth reigns and fear cannot follow. You were always meant for this, not the pain, but the clarity it brought. Not the isolation, but the insight it birthed. Not the exile, but the elevation that came after. You were never wandering, you were being refined. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Psalm 118:22. They said you were too different, too strange, too much, but what they really meant was you were too pure to control, too aware to manipulate, too chosen to ignore. And so they tried to bury you. But what they failed to realize is you were a seed. You have outlived their laughter, You have surpassed their projections. You have walked through every valley with grace they didn't deserve to witness. And now you stand not as a victim of their blindness, but as a vessel of light. You see, your journey was never just about proving them wrong. It was about proving that truth doesn't die in silence. It multiplies, it waits. And when the time is right, it rises, unshakable, undeniable. You have become the living evidence. You no longer need the ones who left to return. You no longer seek answers from those who were never qualified to question you. You no longer shrink your fire to soothe their fear of being exposed. Your path is not dependent on the applause of the blind. You walk now, not because they opened a door, but because you tore the veil yourself. With every step you leave behind the fragments of who they said you were. And in their place you carry truth, weightless, whole. Holy, there is no more begging to be understood. There is no more justifying your knowing. There is no more apology for the light you carry. You are not who you were before the silence. You are not who you were before the storm. You are not who you were when they laughed. You are the proof that truth doesn't need approval. You have risen. Before you go, take a breath. Feel that stirring in your spirit, that quiet knowing. It's not by accident you found this message. It's a reminder, a call back to who you've always been, beneath the noise, beneath the labels, beneath the fear. If this spoke to something deep inside you, comment 777 below. Let it be your signal to the universe that you remember now, that you are rising. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Even when you want to lay it all down, silence the voice, ignore the signs. Something sacred within you won't let go. You see, doubt is not the enemy. It is the refining fire. It asks the hard questions, demands the uncomfortable truths. It strips you of arrogance and forces you to ask again and again, do I really believe this? And when the answer comes, not from your head, but from your soul, you know it's not madness. It's not delusion. It's sight. It's calling. Subscribe if you feel called and stay close. We are just getting started. You are not alone. You are not lost. You are being led. Welcome back to your sacred selves. And yet, even with that, knowing you ache. You ache for companionship, for someone to say, I see it too. You ache for a hand on your shoulder, a voice in the dark, a presence that reminds you that you're not the only one awake. But more than anything, you ache to stop pretending. You long to walk into a room and speak freely. You long to be understood without being dissected. You long to share what's inside without having to translate it into language the blind can accept. But here's the truth you've quietly learned. Some people aren't supposed to see it yet. Some aren't meant to understand. Because revelation has a rhythm and yours arrived early. That early knowing, that intuition that made you the outcast. It's not a curse. It's the evidence that you were chosen to walk ahead, to see before others see, to feel before others feel, to awaken before the shaking comes. But in that space between knowing and validation, in that lonely middle ground where vision hasn't yet turned into reality, you will feel pain. You will want to quit. You will question everything. And that's okay, because every prophet has faced the night. Every visionary has walked through the valley of doubt. Even Jesus in Gethsemane wept alone. So if you are there now, somewhere between belief and exhaustion, between calling and collapse, just know you're not broken, you're becoming, and the weight you feel, that's not insanity. It's the burden of truth waiting to be revealed. Hold on, it's not over. She dreamed in warnings and no one listened. Elena was only 13, the first time it happened. She had a dream, vivid, strange, and terrifying. She saw her neighbor's house, smoke curling out of the windows, flames licking the roof, and a dog barking frantically at the back gate. When she woke up, her sheets were soaked with sweat, and her hands trembled as if the fire had touched her. She told her mother, who offered her a gentle smile and a cup of warm milk. "It was just a nightmare, sweetie," her mother said. "Too much television, maybe." 2 days later, it wasn't just a nightmare. The neighbor's house burned down exactly as she saw it. The dog made it out, but everything else was lost. Elena didn't say anything. She didn't have to. They called you crazy, not just once. Not in passing, they said it with conviction, the kind that cuts deeper than silence. They rolled their eyes, chuckled behind your back, whispered in rooms you weren't invited into. You saw it in their smirks, their carefully crafted distance, their condescending glances that screamed, "Poor thing." So lost in their fantasies, you weren't eccentric, you were delusional. They said a dreamer tangled in shadows no one else could see. Her mother looked at her differently after that, her concern tinged with fear, as if her daughter's dreams were loaded guns no one knew how to disarm. Over the years, the dreams didn't stop. They came in waves, sometimes soft and symbolic, other times sharp and terrifyingly literal. Elena saw breakups before they happened, car crashes before they were reported, deaths before they were mourned. She tried to explain at first, tried to warn her classmates, her teachers, her family. But every attempt at honesty was met with one of three reactions: mockery, fear, or isolation. In high school, they called her Elena, the Oracle. Like it was a joke, boys would ask her to predict test scores or sports outcomes just to laugh when she refused. Girls whispered that she was cursed, or worse, that she made bad things happen by dreaming them into existence. Some teachers pulled her aside to suggest therapy. Others ignored her entirely, treating her as someone too fragile to engage. She became the girl who spoke too little, watched too much, and lived in the corners of every room. What hurt more than the laughter was the loneliness, because no one understood what it felt like to know something terrible was coming and be powerless to stop it. No one understood the weight of seeing too much too soon. No one knew what it did to a person's heart to carry the grief of events that hadn't happened yet. Grief that could not be explained because the world hadn't caught up to it. When she was 17, Elena dreamed of a storm, not a metaphor, a real storm. She saw floodwaters rise over the town bridge, watched cars swallowed whole, heard the screams of people stranded on rooftops. She saw a man clinging to a tree, calling out for help until his voice vanished into wind. When she woke up, she couldn't breathe. The images stayed with her, too sharp, too detailed, too real. This time she said something. She went to the town council meeting and told them a storm was coming. They laughed. One man asked if she'd been watching disaster movies again. Another joked that if she could predict the weather, maybe she should apply to be a meteorologist. Elena left that meeting with her head down, her cheeks burning, but deep inside, she still hoped she was wrong. She wanted to be, because if she was right, people would suffer. If she was right, the town wasn't ready. If she was right, then everything inside her, the knowing, the warnings, the dreams was real, and that was scarier than anything. A week later, the flood came. A record-breaking storm struck the region. The river surged past its banks. The bridge collapsed. Entire blocks of the town went underwater. News crews came in helicopters. Rescue boats were deployed in the middle of the night. Elena watched it all from her window, her face pale, her heart pounding like a drumbeat of finality. The man she saw in the dream, the one who clung to the tree, was found alive, but barely, just like she saw him. This time the town didn't laugh, but they didn't apologize either. They avoided her. They crossed the street when they saw her coming. Some whispered that she must have known something. Others said she was probably involved, because people who can't explain you will do anything to discredit you, even when they've seen the truth with their own eyes. Elena stopped trying to be understood after that. She no longer explained her silence. She no longer asked permission to believe herself. Something in her hardened, not in bitterness, but in quiet resolve. She realized the world didn't need to believe her for her gift to be real. She wasn't dreaming for their comfort. She was dreaming because something greater had chosen her to see. In time, Elena would grow into her power. She would find others like her souls who bore visions, warnings, intuitions, so sharp they cut through illusion. She would help, but only when asked. She would speak, but only when led. And her words, when they came, would carry weight, not because they were louder, but because they were anchored in truth. But that story was still ahead of her. At 17, standing in a town that had learned too late, Elena stared out at the flooded streets and whispered to no one, "I didn't want to be right." And in that moment, the world didn't feel like home. But something in her shifted, because knowing was no longer a curse. It was confirmation, and deep down, Elena finally understood. She wasn't crazy, she was chosen. And the worst part, you started to believe them. You learned to keep quiet, because every time you opened your mouth, their laughter got louder. You tried to share the dreams, the signs, the warnings. You felt things shift before they ever cracked the surface of reality. You saw the storm coming while they were still dancing in the sun. You were never lost, you were being called. It doesn't happen in a flash of lightning or with the dramatic soundtrack of a movie. The moment you begin to awaken is quiet, almost unnoticeable to the outside world. You're still sitting in the same room. The same doubts still swirl in your head. The same voices echo from your past, the ones that told you were wrong. Broken, strange, but something inside you has changed. Not everything, just one thing. A shift, a flicker. A breath of clarity that whispers, wait, what if I was never crazy? What if I was called? It starts there. A thought you don't immediately chase away, a possibility you dare to entertain. And once you give it space, once you stop fighting the voice inside you, the silence begins to break, not with noise, but with knowing. The memories don't haunt you anymore. They teach you. The dreams don't confuse you anymore. They prepare you. The rejection doesn't crush you anymore. It reveals who never deserved access to you in the first place. You begin to remember the signs, not the ones in the world, but the ones within. The way your body tensed before tragedy struck. The way you wept without explanation, only to learn later that something had been lost somewhere in the world. The way your heart ached before anyone else knew a storm was coming. And instead of brushing those moments aside, you begin to collect them like sacred stones, not to prove yourself to anyone, but to build a foundation of remembrance. This is who I've always been. This is what they tried to make me forget. This is the voice I was never meant to silence. You don't rise with arrogance. You rise with reverence. You stand up not to shout, but to stop shrinking. You look in the mirror, not to fix yourself, but to finally see yourself fully. And for the first time in a long time, your reflection doesn't look like a stranger. It looks like someone you're finally ready to believe. It's not about being right anymore. It's about being real. You realize that the world didn't reject you because you were wrong. It rejected you because your presence disrupted the illusion. Because truth, when it walks into a room, makes liars uncomfortable. Because vision, when it speaks, sounds like madness to the blind. And that's when the weight begins to lift, not because the world changes, but because you do. You stop seeking their permission. You stop begging for their understanding. You stop explaining your spirit in a language it was never meant to speak, because you were never made for approval. You were made for purpose. You begin to revisit the scriptures, not as ancient history, but as living guidance. And they're hidden between the familiar lines you find yourself. You see your struggle, your calling, your burden written centuries before your birth. You read the words and feel them leap off the page, not just into your mind, but into your bones. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24:37, it stops you. Because for the first time, you don't just understand Noah, you are Noah. You know what it's like to see the flood before the rain, to build an ark while people party in the streets, to be mocked not for being wrong, but for being early, to warn a world that refuses to listen, to carry a calling that makes no sense until the skies break open. And suddenly you realize, They didn't laugh because you were delusional. They laughed because you reminded them they were asleep. You were never just a voice crying in the wilderness. You were a signal fire, a storm siren, a divine interruption in a system built on comfort and lies. And now that you know, you can't unknow. You can't go back to pretending you don't see what you see. You can't unfeel what you've always felt. So you rise not in defiance, but in obedience. You accept the isolation not as punishment, but as preparation. You embrace the silence, not as emptiness, but as sacred space. You walk differently, speak more carefully, live more intentionally, because you're no longer trying to fit in. You're walking in something higher now. You begin to see others, the ones like you, the watchers, the dreamers, the sensitive souls who feel too much and say too little, the ones who've been labeled dismissed, ignored. You recognize them not because they tell you who they are, but because their eyes carry the same weight as yours. And you don't need many. Just one is enough to remind you that you were never alone. Because the calling wasn't just given to you, it's awakening in others too. And here's the truth, you finally accept. You were not made to be understood. But each time you tried to speak truth, it was met with disbelief, not because your words lacked power, but because their world couldn't handle what you knew. They didn't want to believe. They needed you to be wrong. Because if you were right, everything they clung to was built on a lie. So they labeled you, pushed you to the margins. Because that's what the world does with prophets. It locks them out of the temple and calls them mad. It wasn't just that you made them uncomfortable. You were made to understand. You were not made to follow. You were made to lead. You were not made to fit the world. You were made to shake it, so you no longer curse the dreams. You no longer fear the silence. You no longer apologize for the fire in your bones because you have awakened, and now there is no turning back. When the signs won't let you look away anymore. At first the signs were subtle, too subtle, just a flicker in the corner of the eye, a strange coincidence that lingered a little too long in the back of your mind. Numbers repeating 111, 3, 3, 7, 7 on clocks, receipts, license plates. You would pause for a second, furrow your brow, and then shake it off, but they came again and again, always showing up right when doubt began to creep in, as if some invisible hand was gently tapping your shoulder, whispering, keep going. You're not imagining this. Then came the dreams, not the blurry ones that evaporate in the morning light. These were different, crisp, vivid, prophetic. You'd wake with your heart pounding the images etched into your memory like carvings in stone. Some were symbolic, wrapped in metaphor. Others were terrifyingly literal, only to reveal themselves days, sometimes hours later in real life. The veil between waking and sleeping blurred, and your nights became just as charged as your days. You began to wonder if you were sleeping at all or just stepping into another layer of truth. You started to feel it in your body before the phone rang, before the email came, before the world shifted. There was a tightness in your chest, a pull in your gut, a pressure in the air. You began sensing conversations before they happened, outcomes before they arrived, change before it touched the surface. You would sit in stillness and suddenly feel grief that didn't belong to you yet. Then hours later, a call would come, a loss, an ending, a rupture you couldn't have seen with human eyes. That's when you stopped brushing it off. That's when you started listening, because something bigger was speaking to you. Not in thunder or lightning, but in the quiet alignment of moments, in the rhythm of numbers, in the architecture of dreams, in the way your soul would whisper before your mind could make sense of it. And you weren't the only one. There was a man named Thomas. He was 78, a Vietnam vet with a stiff back, gentle eyes and hands that had seen both war and prayer. He didn't speak much. Years of pain had carved his words into quiet, careful things. But one morning he called his daughter and asked her to bring the family over that evening. No reason, just a feeling. That day he cleaned his house, not a typical tidy up, it was something deeper. He moved slowly, reverently, dusting old photos, folding blankets, placing his Bible in the center of the dining room table. He pulled out a faded box from the closet, letters from his wife who had passed 15 years earlier. He read them one by one, tears falling onto paper yellowed with time. When the family arrived, he smiled wider than he had in years. He told stories. He laughed from a place that hadn't laughed in decades. He hugged his grandson like it would be the last time. That night, Thomas went to bed and never woke up. His heart simply stopped. But he knew, somehow he knew his daughter later told a nurse, he was already halfway home. You see, those who are called, those who walk with spiritual sight, don't just receive messages for themselves. They become vessels for moments that matter. They hold space for transition. They carry the weight of knowing when words fail and logic runs dry. It wasn't magic, it wasn't madness, it was alignment, a soul in tune with something far beyond the material. And now those signs follow you too. The angel numbers still appear right when you're questioning your path. The dreams return clearer, more urgent. The sensations in your body speak louder, demanding to be trusted. You've begun to realize that you don't need to understand every sign to honor it. You don't need to explain the knowing to anyone for it to be valid. This isn't about proof, it's about presence. It's about listening to the divine language that most people have forgotten. Because signs don't shout, they invite. It's that you made them see too much. You reminded them of everything they tried to ignore, so they laughed. They called it nonsense, said you were too intense, too emotional, too much, but deep down you always knew. You knew it in your bones. You knew it in the patterns, the dreams, the quiet whispers that came at 3 a.m. You knew it even as you wiped tears in silence, wondering if you'd imagined it all. You weren't guessing. You were remembering who you are. And now you're starting to respond not with fear, not with skepticism, but with sacred attention. You journal them, you pray over them, you sit with them, even when they don't make sense yet. Because deep down you know they're not random, they're not accidents. They are confirmations, reminders from a realm that speaks in symbols, in patterns and echoes that wrap around your life like divine fingerprints. Some will call it superstition, others will call it coincidence. Let them. You've walked too far, felt too much, seen too clearly. You no longer wait for permission to believe what your spirit has always known. You know what Thomas knew. You know what the numbers mean. You know what the dreams are telling you. And as strange as it may sound, you are learning to feel at home in this mystery because you are no longer searching for signs. You are becoming one. You don't need proof anymore. You just know there comes a quiet point on the journey. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or shouts or fireworks. It slips in like a breath at dawn, unnoticed by the world but unmistakable to your soul. You no longer wake up asking, why do I feel this way, or what does this mean? The ache, the knowing, the pull, they no longer demand explanation. You stop looking for reasons. You stop asking for evidence. Because something deep within you has settled. It's not about logic anymore, it's about alignment. The shift is subtle, like the turning of a tide in the dark. You don't see it coming, but you feel it rise. The part of you that once begged for validation now sits in stillness, not silent from defeat, but anchored in truth. The doubts that used to torment you have grown tired. The noise that used to rattle you has lost its power. You've stopped trying to convince the world of your worth. You've stopped fighting for a seat at tables that were never built for people like you. And in that quiet, something sacred is born. A new way of being, a new rhythm, a new depth. You begin to move differently, not because someone told you to, but because your steps are finally syncing with something greater. You begin to see the world not just with your eyes, but with your spirit. You begin to speak less and listen more, not out of fear, but because what's rising inside of you is too holy to be wasted on ears that refuse to hear. There is a softness in your strength now, a grace in your discernment, a calm in your certainty. You no longer argue with life. You flow with it. You no longer demand answers. You trust the unfolding. You begin to honor the space between what you feel and what others see. Because you know now that not everything sacred is visible, not everything true is explainable. Not everything real can be proved to those who live behind walls of logic. You begin to hold your head differently, not higher, not lower, just steadier. You carry yourself with the quiet power of someone who no longer doubts their assignment. You look back at the moments that used to break you and realize they were building you. You trace the scars on your heart like they're maps guiding you home to yourself. You no longer need to revisit the battlefield to remember the war you've won, not because they admitted you were right, but because you finally believed you were never wrong. People start to notice, not because you're louder, but because you've stopped hiding. Your presence begins to speak in a language only truth can speak, calm, firm, unwavering. You no longer seek attention, yet attention finds you. You don't need the spotlight, you are the light. And it shines not because you forced it to, but because it's always been there, buried under years of fear, shame, and false humility. You've stopped apologizing for your gift. You've stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. You've stopped delaying your obedience because of their disbelief. You understand now that your calling was never a group decision. It was whispered in the quiet spaces of your becoming. It was etched into your bones long before anyone else had an opinion. And even when you tried to run from it, it waited. Patient, unshaken, unrelenting. There's a holiness in that kind of love. You've stopped asking, "Why me?" and started whispering, "Thank you." Not because the path is easy, not because the cost is light, but because you've seen what happens when you trust. You've seen what unfolds when you follow the pull, remembering what was placed inside you long before this world tried to silence it. And now as the world starts to crack, as illusions collapse one by one, they're not laughing anymore because now everything you said is happening. You've seen what rises from ashes when you let go of needing to understand everything and instead choose to honor what you know in your spirit. You've stopped explaining yourself in rooms that feel wrong. You've stopped translating your soul into dialects that twist your truth. You've stopped holding your breath, hoping someone else will give you permission to exhale. You've stopped wondering if you're too much. You've stopped fearing that you'll never be enough, because now you see it clearly. The signs, the dreams, the pull, the pain, it all led here. Not to a conclusion, but to a conviction. Not to answers, but to awareness. Not to proof, but to peace. You are no longer the person who doubts the voice inside. You are the one who listens, who follows, who trusts, and that trust has become your compass. That surrender has become your strength. That certainty has become your sanctuary. The world may still not understand. Let them wonder. Let them whisper. You no longer need to defend your knowing. You no longer bend yourself to fit the shape of their comfort. You are walking in something eternal now. Something that doesn't need applause or permission or validation. Something rooted in the unseen and backed by the divine. You have stopped searching for signs because your life has become one. You have stopped waiting for miracles because your existence is already a testament. You have stopped needing to be understood because now you finally understand. And here in this sacred knowing, one truth rises above all others. You were never crazy, you were chosen. They laughed because you saw what they couldn't face. They didn't laugh because you were wrong. They laughed because your very presence made them uncomfortable. You didn't just speak truth, you became truth. And truth, when it stands in front of people who have built their lives on illusion, is not welcomed. It's feared, mocked, ridiculed. Not because it is weak, but because it is too strong to ignore. What they feared wasn't you. It was what you represented. You reminded them of everything they tried to forget. You stirred the still waters of their denial. You threatened their carefully constructed world. The lies they told themselves to feel safe. The comfort zones they mistook for wisdom. And instead of listening, instead of pausing, instead of being honest with themselves, they chose the easier path. They laughed, they rolled their eyes. They dismissed you because it's always easier to laugh at the messenger than to look in the mirror. The moment you began to speak what they were too afraid to admit, you became a threat. Not because you had power over them, but because you awakened something within them they were not ready to confront. You were the living proof that there was more truth, more depth, more divine calling than they were ready to accept. Your words weren't dangerous, your light was. They called it arrogance, they called it delusion. But what they were really trying to do was dim what they couldn't understand. And deep down, a part of them knew. They knew you weren't making it up. They knew you weren't hallucinating. They felt it too, that shift in the air when you walked into the room, that strange pull in their chest when you spoke, that heaviness when they looked into your eyes and saw something they couldn't explain. So they laughed because that's what the world does to truth when it isn't ready. They laughed just like they laughed at Joseph. He was just a boy when he told his brothers his dreams. Dreams that didn't make sense to them. Dreams that sounded too grand, too strange, too divine to come from someone they had grown up with. They didn't just question the dreams, they hated them. Because those dreams meant that Joseph saw something greater, that he was chosen, that he was marked for something none of them could control. So they threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery, lied to their father, tried to erase him. But God used their betrayal as the very vehicle to elevate Joseph. Every stone they hurled became a step toward his purpose. Every lie they told became a line in the story of redemption. And when the famine came, when the world turned dry and desperate, Joseph stood in the palace not as a prisoner, but as a provider. And the very mouths that mocked him bowed before him. Years later, when his brothers realized who he was, they trembled in fear. They expected revenge. They expected rage. But Joseph looked into their eyes, and with a voice soaked in divine clarity, he said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. The loneliest battle is the one you fight in silence." There's a certain kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's heavy. It's the silence that settles in your chest after too many conversations, end with blank stares, polite nods, or that familiar smirk. It says, "Here we go again." You stop talking not because you have nothing left to say, but because speaking truth in a room full of deaf ears feels like shouting into a void that swallows your voice whole. Genesis 50:20. That line has echoed through time because it speaks to every chosen one who has ever been ridiculed for their revelation. They intended to silence you, but God intended to refine you. They intended to shame you, but God intended to shape you. They intended to cast you out, but God intended to set you apart. Their laughter was never about humor. It was about fear because you were the mirror they didn't ask for. You were the storm they couldn't control. You were the reminder that their spiritual sleep had a cost and you were awake. And that's the part they couldn't handle. Because if you were right then, they had to face how wrong they had been. If your visions were true, then their blindness wasn't innocent, it was willful. If your path was divine, then their rejection wasn't a misunderstanding, it was rebellion against the call of God. They didn't want to hear, but the truth never needed their permission, and neither did you. It hurts, yes, being mocked, misunderstood, thrown aside, but now you see it. It was never really about you. It was about the weight of what you carried, the assignment written into your spirit, the fire that could not be hidden, the destiny that could not be stopped. And in time, some of them will come back. Some will seek your wisdom in secret. Some will try to rewrite the past, acting like they always believed in you. Some will never say a word, but their silence will speak louder than their mockery ever did. You don't need revenge. You don't need an apology. You don't need their recognition because you have something far more powerful: clarity, peace, and purpose. You now know what Joseph knew. You were not just attacked, you were positioned. You were not just mocked, you were moved. You were not just broken, you were built. So the next time you remember their laughter, let it remind you not of their ignorance, but of your resilience. Let it echo as proof that you carried something holy even when they couldn't see it. And above all, hold on to this truth: you were never laughed at because you were lost. You were laughed at because you were light, and light by its very nature disrupts the darkness. You were never crazy, you were chosen. You were led all along by whispers they couldn't hear. There is a moment when the noise of the world begins to fade. Not because the world has gone quiet, but because something louder has awakened inside you. At first, you may not know what it is. It arrives without warning, a dream that lingers longer than it should, a number that appears too often to be coincidence, a feeling in your gut that something is shifting. You dismiss it, then feel it again. Louder, closer, clearer, and slowly you begin to wonder, am I being led? This is how awakening begins, not with fire from the sky or booming voices from clouds, but with soft, persistent threads pulling at your soul. A dream that feels more real than waking life, a whisper in your spirit at the moment you're about to make a wrong decision, a nudge to turn left when logic says right. You don't have proof, but you have something stronger. You have knowing. You begin to move differently. You start to notice patterns, the way certain symbols keep appearing, the way certain names repeat, the way your spirit reacts to spaces before your mind understands why. You feel drawn to people you haven't met, places you've never seen, truths you've never studied but somehow already understand. It is as if you are remembering something you were never taught, a wisdom older than your body, a voice not your own but deeply familiar. This is not imagination, this is awakening, and you are not the first to walk this road. Think of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, a teenage girl untrained in war, unversed in politics, yet she heard the voice of God and followed. She was mocked, feared, called delusional, but her courage shook nations. She led armies with a conviction that defied her age, her gender, her status. She claimed no glory for herself. She only followed what she heard in the quiet. When the world called her insane, she stood firm. And after a while, even you begin to question what you once knew so clearly. You sit alone in your room, staring at the ceiling while everyone else sleeps. Outside, the world spins with noise. Laughter, news feeds, music, distractions designed to keep people blind. But inside you, it's different. You feel everything. You sense the friction in the air before the chaos arrives. You feel the tremble beneath the surface before the ground breaks. Because when God calls you, you cannot unhear it. When the fire touches you, you cannot pretend you are cold. Or consider Daniel, the dream interpreter of Babylon, taken from his home, thrown into a foreign kingdom, surrounded by false gods. Still he listened to the voice of the Most High. When others bowed to golden statues, he bowed only to truth. When others feared the king, he feared only the silence of God. His dreams were not dreams, they were blueprints. Visions carved into the night to warn and prepare. He was not the strongest, but he was the clearest, because his ears were tuned to the divine. You begin to see these figures not as distant legends, but as mirrors. Their stories begin to feel like echoes of your own. You realize you too have been chosen to hear, to sense, to know. Maybe you can't explain it, maybe you still doubt it, but the signs haven't stopped. The dreams haven't faded, and the feeling that you are being led only grows stronger. You wake up at 3:33 a.m. for no reason. You feel chills during moments of silence. You look at someone and know what they're carrying before they speak. You feel a presence when you're alone, a tug when you're lost, a push when you're afraid. The world calls it intuition. The Bible calls it the Spirit. You know it as home. There is nothing random about this path. The veil is thinning. The timing is divine. You were not placed here to wander. You were placed here to awaken. You were not left behind. You were led ahead. The loneliness you feel is not isolation. It is elevation. You are walking where few dare, seeing what few are willing to see, feeling what most numb themselves to avoid. And still you go forward. Because something deep inside you already knows this path is not about being right. It's about being ready. Ready to listen. Ready to obey. Ready to carry what others dropped. You are not here to convince. You are here to become. So let them question. Let them laugh. Let them stay asleep. You are being called higher, and every sign, every dream, every moment of divine interruption is an invitation to trust what you feel more than what you see. Your spirit is not confused, it is awake. You are not crazy, you are chosen, and the one who calls you by name is still speaking. Can you hear him? You tried to hide your light just to feel less alone. There is a moment when the noise of the world begins to fade. Not because the world has gone quiet, but because something louder has awakened inside you. At first, you may not know what it is. It arrives without warning, a dream that lingers longer than it should, a number that appears too often to be coincidence, a feeling in your gut that something is shifting. You dismiss it, then feel it again. Louder, closer, clearer, and slowly you begin to wonder, am I being led? This is how awakening begins. Not with fire from the sky or booming voices from clouds, but with soft, persistent threads pulling at your soul. A dream that feels more real than waking life. A whisper in your spirit at the moment you're about to make a wrong decision. A nudge to turn left when logic says right. You don't have proof, but you have something stronger. You have knowing. You begin to move differently. You start to notice patterns, the way certain symbols keep appearing. The way certain names repeat, the way your spirit reacts to spaces before your mind understands why. You feel drawn to people you haven't met, places you've never seen, truths you've never studied, but somehow already understand. It is as if you are remembering something you were never taught, a wisdom older than your body, a voice not your own, but deeply familiar. This is not imagination. This is awakening. And you are not the first to walk this road. Think of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, a teenage girl untrained in war, unversed in politics. Yet she heard the voice of God and followed. She was mocked, feared, called delusional. But her courage shook nations. She led armies with a conviction that defied her age, her gender, her status. She claimed no glory for herself. She only followed what she heard in the quiet. When the world called her insane, she stood firm. You see the subtle signs, the synchronicities, the patterns, the whispers of change, and it shakes you not because they exist, but because no one else seems to notice. That's when the doubt creeps in, not like a scream, but like a slow, steady drip. Maybe they're right, you think. Maybe I'm too sensitive, too deep, too strange. You start to filter your words, edit yourself. You rehearse conversations before you speak. Just to sound normal, you smile when you want to scream. Because when God calls you, you cannot unhear it. When the fire touches you, you cannot pretend you are cold. Or consider Daniel, the dream interpreter of Babylon, taken from his home, thrown into a foreign kingdom, surrounded by false gods. Still, he listened to the voice of the Most High. When others bowed to golden statues, he bowed only to truth. When others feared the king, he feared only the silence of God. His dreams were not dreams, they were blueprints, visions carved into the night to warn and prepare. He was not the strongest, but he was the clearest, because his ears were tuned to the divine. You begin to see these figures not as distant legends, but as mirrors. Their stories begin to feel like echoes of your own. You realize you too have been chosen to hear, to sense, to know. Maybe you can't explain it. Maybe you still doubt it, but the signs haven't stopped. The dreams haven't faded. And the feeling that you are being led only grows stronger. You wake up at 3:33 a.m. for no reason. You feel chills during moments of silence. You look at someone and know what they're carrying before they speak. You feel a presence when you're alone, a tug when you're lost, a push when you're afraid. The world calls it intuition. The Bible calls it the Spirit. You know it as home. There is nothing random about this path. The veil is thinning. The timing is divine. You were not placed here to wander. You were placed here to awaken. You were not left behind. You were led ahead. The loneliness you feel is not isolation. It is elevation. You are walking where few dare, seeing what few are willing to see, feeling what most numb themselves to avoid, and still you go forward. Because something deep inside you already knows this path is not about being right. It's about being ready, ready to listen, ready to obey, ready to carry what others dropped. You are not here to convince, you are here to become. So let them question, let them laugh, let them stay asleep. You are being called higher. And every sign, every dream, every moment of divine interruption is an invitation to trust what you feel more than what you see. Your spirit is not confused, it is awake. You are not crazy, you are chosen. And the one who calls you by name is still speaking. Can you hear him? But awakening is not always glorious. There is a shadow side to this journey that no one talks about. The crushing loneliness, the feeling of standing in a room full of people and still being unseen. The slow death of connection, not because you wanted it, but because it could no longer hold the weight of your truth. You start to notice the looks, the whispers, the way people pull back when your eyes hold too much. They don't know what to do with you. They call you intense, overwhelming, weird. Some even call you dangerous. You begin to feel like a stranger in your own life. Friends drift, family avoids the real conversations. You laugh a little less. Not because you've lost joy, but because you can no longer pretend. You see too much, feel too deeply, sense what others dismiss. And while they keep moving forward in ignorance, you stand still aching. Not because you don't know the way, but because the way is costing you everything. There comes a moment where you think maybe it would be easier to just stop. Maybe if I could just turn it off, go back to normal, blend in, numb out, pretend. But the truth is you can't, because the awakening has already begun. The vision has already opened your eyes, and once you've seen, you can never unsee. Once you've known, you can never unknow. You try to silence the call, but it screams louder in the quiet. You weep, not because you're weak, but because you're tired. You are carrying something that cannot be named, a weight you never asked for, a fire that won't go out. You didn't choose this, it chose you. And now you walk through this world half visible, misunderstood, aching for connection, but unable to lie about who you are anymore. There is a cost to this path. It will strip you, it will break you, it will press you until you no longer know your old name. But buried beneath the grief, something holy is being formed, a resolve, a power, a calling. You are not breaking down. You are breaking open. You are being refined like gold in the fire. What feels like isolation is actually consecration. What feels like rejection is divine redirection. What feels like the end is only the threshold. Because even when you want to quit, something won't let you. Even when your heart says enough, your soul whispers, keep going. Even when your body is weary, your spirit refuses to lie down. You can't explain it. You can't walk away because you're not just walking. You're being led.